Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Plantation, Racism and Resistance in the Halls of Congress, by James R. Jones. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Prologue. My engagement with Congress began in 2006, when I was selected as a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation summer intern. For nearly 8 weeks, I worked for my local representative, Shaka Fatah, who represented Philadelphia for over a decade. I naively thought that I would interact a lot with the rep that summer. However, most of my time was spent with other staffers in the office, who managed my internship experience. They taught me the ins and outs of the legislative process by allowing me to work closely with them on substantive assignments. They were kind and generous with their time. I developed a deep respect for them as the people who manifested the rep's agenda. They were the ones who researched and wrote legislation, drafted press statements, answered messages from constituents, and developed strategies to make the rep's political vision come true. I came to understand that they and other congressional staffers were principal actors in lawmaking. I continued interning for the rep from 2006 to 2008 while I was an undergraduate at the George Washington University. This extended work experience gave me more time to observe staff dynamics. For example, I frequently visited different offices to obtain lawmakers' signatures for official letters. I would wait in the reception area of each office while staff provided an official signature. While I waited, I would glance at the photographs and awards that adorned walls, eat the unique candies that each office proudly offered as products from their districts, and listen to conversations within earshot. I would also take note of the social characteristics of who worked in each office and the different levels of racial representation among staff. Representative Fatah, who is black, had a primarily black staff. However, I rarely saw black staffers when I visited white lawmakers' offices. Those offices were mostly white. I began to think about how such different configurations of racial representation among staff affected lawmaking, especially since I had come to understand the influential role of legislative staff. In 2009, I decided to intern in another congressional office to get a different experience from what I had known. I interned for a white lawmaker who, unsurprisingly, had a primarily white staff. My internship experience in this office was completely different, including my relationship with staff. In Representative Fatah's office, I was treated as a valued member of the team. Even the staff in his district office knew me. To them, I was more than just the perennial intern, our internal joke about my long tenure in the office. They knew about my interests, ambitions, and skills. However, in this new office, I was just an intern, and one of many. I was only expected to answer the phone and respond to constituent mail. To be sure, these are all typical intern duties. However, these were tasks that I had rarely completed before, in part because my old office took the time to get to know me, evaluated what I could do, and offered me numerous opportunities for professional growth. They allowed me to research and track legislation and attend policy meetings with other Democratic staffers. I really lucked out with my first office. The day-to-day activities of most Hill interns more closely resemble my second internship experience, regardless of the lawmaker or the racial composition of their staff. Nonetheless, the different cultures in these offices each had an impact on my development as a young black professional. The disjuncture between the two internship experiences was demoralizing. In one office, I was nurtured, and in the other, I was ignored. I dreaded coming to work, and when I did, I volunteered for any assignment that would get me out of the office. I would quickly step forward to take a letter to be signed or pick up a flag that had flown over the Capitol for a constituent. During these errands, I would return to my old office for a moment of reprieve to cope with these feelings of boredom and loneliness. While I wandered through the halls, I began practicing common cultural gestures like the black nod to establish a connection with other black staffers. I found myself nodding to other black staffers, many of whom were strangers to me, to fortify my strength to just complete the workday and the remaining weeks of my internship. At this time, I wondered how other black staffers felt in their offices. Did they experience the isolation and unfulfillment that I did in a majority white office? This time around, I left Congress disenchanted and with more questions than answers about the legislature as an institution. My congressional internship experiences planted the seeds for the Last Plantation. It provided me with an up-close lesson of the powerful role congressional staff hold in lawmaking. It also taught me how race and racism were organizing features in their careers and the everyday occurrences of our national legislature. Introduction. It has been slave labor on the Hill for years for blacks who have had no upward mobility, no chance for better working conditions. Congress might be exempt from those laws, but we must make sure that our employees are treated equally and fairly. Representative Harold Ford, Sr., 1989. This is a rich white man's place. Joseph, black congressional staffer. The United States Congress is known as the Last Plantation. You will not find this inglorious moniker in any of the many introductory texts that survey America's history, nor does it appear in any advanced readings about legislative studies. You will not hear this nickname parlayed among political scientists, but it is a name used widely and often by the people who know Congress most intimately, lawmakers of both parties and their sizable and powerful staffs. In designating Congress as the Last Plantation, these congressmen, staff, and even reporters were, perhaps unknowingly and unwittingly, identifying what I argue is a central dynamic in preserving America's racial hierarchy. Drawing on my own experiences as a congressional staffer, along with more than 75 interviews, I make a three-part argument in this book. First, that racism and race have formed and maintained a racial hierarchy in the heart of our nation's most important lawmaking body. Second, that congressional staffers substantively shape legislation and policy outcomes that are largely underplayed, unappreciated, and overall absent in the literature. Third, and relatedly, that the racial hierarchy within the congressional workplace, combined with the outsized power of congressional staffers, plays a significant role in instantiating white supremacy in federal law and throughout American politics. While the existence of this congressional plantation is in some ways glaringly obvious, members of Congress are overwhelmingly white, their aides equally homogeneous, and low-paid service workers are mostly black and Latino, this hierarchy is in other ways quite invisible to the American public. The structure and ethos of Congress make it convenient for congressional workers to be invisible, obscuring their identity, labor, and existence. These staffers work behind the scenes writing legislation, organizing hearings, and maintaining the Capitol. They are the machinery, mechanisms, and glue that make Congress work. While there is certainly much that they do that is influential and invisible, I reveal throughout this book how racism is an even more powerful and even less visible force that effectively governs Congress. Racism shapes the work of congressional staffers, impacting who works there, what they do, how they do it, and what kinds of careers and lives they will go on to lead. Most vitally, I argue that by governing the lives and careers of congressional staffers, racism shapes Congress and the entire American political system. The result is that racial inequality is an inherent part of the daily work of Congress, and it meaningfully shapes the work Congress does, the laws they pass, the deals they broker, and the lived realities of the American people. The roots of the Last Plantation nickname are deep and knotted, but also quite simple. The thousands of people who are employed by Congress, from the senators' aides to the janitors and cooks who make their lives possible, were not covered by the legal workplace protections that cover every other American worker. Congress has written and passed numerous laws that improve the lives and the careers of the American worker, though inequalities in our culture remain abundant, and though there are certain realms of life, like income and wealth distribution, where things are getting worse rather than better. The last century of American law contains a clear direction when it comes to the rights of workers. The first and most noticeable of these was New Deal legislation in the 1930s that established a minimum wage, standardized work hours, and emboldened unions to counter unbridled capitalism. Then in 1964 came the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination and removed barriers from the workplace for people of color, extending these protections to white women as well as immigrant and religious minorities. As a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, American workplaces grew more diverse. White women and people of color who were previously excluded from professional workplaces or assigned to the most junior roles gained entry into new professions and ascended into senior roles. While progress from this legislation has been uneven, private and nonprofit workplaces undoubtedly became more egalitarian as a result. After the Civil Rights Act, Congress moved to assure safe and healthy working conditions for men and women by setting and enforcing tough standards. Across the 20th century, Congress passed numerous laws that applied to other employers but not to itself. Lawmakers argued that they had to preserve the separation of powers between two branches of the federal government to ensure they remained equal. Lawmakers worried that the executive branch, which enforces federal workplace regulations, would not only oversee the congressional workplace, but, more dangerously, would begin to regulate congressional power. Their answer to this imagined constitutional conundrum was for Congress to exempt itself from federal workplace laws. As a consequence, congressional workers were denied, again and again and again, the increasingly expanded set of rights that federal law guaranteed to every other American worker. This is until lawmakers passed the Congressional Accountability Act in 1995, which applied 11 federal workplace laws to the legislative branch. Beginning in the 1970s, black congressional employees and a handful of courageous lawmakers drew attention to widespread racial and gender discrimination in the congressional workplace. They pointed to an unequal distribution of staff positions along racial lines, unfair salary practices, and inequity in safe standards among workers in the Capitol. These workers and lawmakers argued that since congressional workers were exempt from the protections of federal workplace laws, Congress was one of the last places where you could still discriminate and exploit workers without legal ramifications. In a new racial epoch committed to equal opportunity and anti-discrimination, Congress was an outlier. It was the only institution to survive our racist past unchanged. Black employees began referring to their place of work as the Last Plantation. In 1978, Ohio Senator John Glenn became the first lawmaker to use the term on the record. During a Senate hearing about the handling of discrimination complaints, he said, "No longer can the Congress of the United States be viewed as the last plantation where anything goes." The name stuck, and almost 50 years later, it still applies. The Capitol is an overwhelmingly white space. Black Capitol. In white spaces such as Congress, black people carve out spaces for themselves. In The Last Plantation, I explore how black workers hold and create agency to shape their own destinies and confront white domination. Throughout this book, I will explore the many ways black people in the Capitol use Congress to fight racism rather than entrench it. Though black lawmakers are a part of these contestations, their contributions and accomplishments are well recorded. There is a much larger story of black capital that needs to be told. It is the story of black workers' invisible labor in the Capitol. Black workers are not elected. They cast no legislative votes. However, they are important actors both in showing how Congress is a racialized institution and also how that institution can be altered from within. While I will focus on the careers and experience of black staffers specifically, black workers employed in service and auxiliary roles also labor to keep the Capitol running. The story of black people in the Capitol would be incomplete without them. Black service workers challenge racism in the Capitol too. In fact, they did it first, because for over a century, these were the only positions on the Hill available to black men and women. What's more, the fates of black staffers and service workers are intertwined and key to understanding how Congress has transformed as a racialized institution over the last century. I offer black capital as a conceptual framework to identify and explain the power and agency of black congressional workers. Black workers' efforts to recruit other black men and women to the congressional workplace and adaptive strategies that nurture and affirm group membership and belonging is black capital. Black capital, as a form of labor and practice of value creation, as well as a quality of social and cultural capital, encompasses black workers' expertise and ingenuity, particularly that which they use to advance legislative work as well as their own collective efforts to make the congressional workplace more inclusive, fair, and just. At the same time, black capital, like all capital, is context-dependent and expresses the relational and spatial dimensions of black political power. It is based upon a black epistemology that recognizes the extraordinary contributions of everyday black folks and that captures the multitude of ways they understand and use power. Black capital is a form of social capital amplified by the processes and conditions of black labor and government. It is seminal to claims for black freedom and racial justice on the Hill and across the nation. Consequently, this framework offers a more expansive view of American racial formations, particularly who has power and how it is used in American politics. The presence of black workers predates the election of the first black members of Congress by almost 60 years. Lawmakers employed black workers first as attendants and messengers in the early 19th century, and after the Civil War, they began to hire them in greater numbers to celebrate and cement their new status as citizens, just as the first African Americans were elected to Congress. Black employment continued in the Capitol throughout the nadir of black politics between 1901 and 1928, when no African Americans served in Congress. In the 1930s, lawmakers hired black professionals to work in their personal and committee offices. Black workers are witnesses, in other words, to 2 centuries of racism. They have been the loudest and longest critics of inequity on the Hill, as it has a direct impact on their livelihoods. Their careers and experiences make it clear that institutional analyses of Congress that do not account for the constitutive role of racism in legislative history are incomplete. Just as important, their careers prove that change is possible. There is much we can learn by placing black workers at the center of legislative analysis. By highlighting black capital, I aim to broaden how we study Congress. Feminist scholar of Congress Cindy Rosenthal said, "Our understanding of institutions is inextricably bound to the dominant individuals who populate them." I want to change that. In the following chapters, I will focus primarily on the career experiences and activism of black staffers, as well as black service workers. Both groups point to ways that legislative processes work and that are generally unaccounted for in race-neutral congressional analyses. Existing profiles on congressional staff assume that they are exclusively young or middle-aged white men, and they do not fully account for how race and gender shape professional identities or career trajectories. I aim, through focusing on black capital, to broaden the conceptual and methodological approaches used in studying Congress by taking a black epistemological standpoint that recognizes the significance of black workers as valuable sources of knowledge. By black epistemologies, I refer both to the broad corpus of literary and analytical work by black and black studies scholars, as well as the lived, everyday ways of knowing and making do that black people across the country use to get by and to thrive. Black epistemological approaches can reveal theories of knowledge that emanate from the lived experiences of black men and women. On Capitol Hill, by attending to black staffers' knowledge and practices through a black epistemologies approach, I demonstrate how congressional employment is a white racial project and how black workers' knowledge and actions reorient this project to facilitate racial justice and more inclusive policymaking. In The Last Plantation, I use the plantation metaphor to investigate how Congress operates as an inequality regime. The term coined by sociologist Joan Acker describes how race, gender, and class all act as intersecting and overlapping forces that shape how organizations operate. As she describes, these forces dictate who has the power and who does not. Workplace decisions that explain how work should be completed, hiring and promotions, salary, rewards and punishment, respect and authority, and feelings of belongings and non-belonging. To this end, Joseph, who I quoted in the epigraph, told me Congress was a plantation. He explained that whites have the visible face of Congress, but all the work done behind the scenes is done by blacks, including most of the cooks and custodians in congressional restaurants. The congressional workplace is unlike most inequality regimes that sociologists typically study. Congress is Congress. It is an immensely powerful institution where inequality that is anchored locally has national and global implications. While it is important for us to understand the intersectional nature of legislative inequality, I will focus our attention on its racial underpinning, owing to the extant literature on gender and class in Congress. I build on the work of sociologists of racism like Wendy Leo Moore, Victor Ray, Adia Wingfield, and Celeste Watkins Hayes, all of whom draw attention to how race is at the center of organizational life. They demonstrate how racism shapes how organizations develop and change, determines positions and salary and consequently rewards and punishments, and influences individuals' behaviors and interactions. Of course, racism does not explain everything that happens in an organization. However, as these scholars point out, it does explain a lot, and for much of our country's history, we have been unwilling to acknowledge how much racism does matter. The study of racialized organizations commands our attention to focus on structure and the permanence of racism. I agree with much of this scholarship, but I also want to convey how racialized organizations are malleable. I see Congress in black and white. It is a space built by enslaved black laborers and where there have been 10 times as many white enslavers to serve in the legislature than black men and women. A workplace where the namesakes of the office buildings honor white men who have served in Congress, and where one building in particular, the Russell Senate Office Building, commemorates an avowed white supremacist, and where insular hiring and promotion processes yield a supermajority of whites in congressional staff positions. At the same time, I see Congress as a space where black men and women have fought for their right to be included, and once inside, where they continued to fight, standing up to racists and demanding justice. From them, we can understand the shortcomings of Congress, but also its potential to execute democratic principles. I develop my arguments in 2 parts by analyzing the career experiences of black congressional staffers. First, I explore how the congressional workplace produces inequality. Lawmakers' decisions to exempt themselves from the regulations they impose on other employers have led to insular hiring and management decisions that perpetuate racial inequality. They have created and managed an unequal workplace where positions are racially stratified, space is segregated, and identities and interactions are racialized. This hierarchy constrains the agency of non-white staffers and reinforces the credentialing of a white power elite. Second, I demonstrate how black workers, from legislative staffers to cafeteria servers, have fought back against these unequal processes and injustices on Capitol Hill. I reveal how black workers have reimagined Congress as a black Capitol, a site of minority empowerment where they use their institutional positions, however marginal they might be, to promote racial justice. Legislative work and the reproduction of racism. Previous research has examined the duties and responsibilities of legislative staff and investigated whether this group is made up of mere passive agents who support their political bosses, or if this unelected class exercises independent effects on the policy-making process. However, rather than looking at the power that legislative staff hold individually, it is important to consider how power is distributed within this large work system, and how it affects democratic governance and political representation more broadly. Put simply, it matters, substantively and symbolically, how work opportunities are allocated in a national lawmaking institution. Most Americans, myself included, are unaware of the sophisticated ecosystem that exists under the iconic neoclassical dome and how it functions day to day. I was so overwhelmed when I first stepped inside the Capitol as a summer intern in 2006. The Capitol was much, much bigger than I expected. I had thought a lot about what it would be like to step onto the House floor for the first time or visit a hearing room in the Senate, but I did not really consider how Capitol Hill was a world unto itself, similar in size to my university campus only 3 miles away. There are the personal offices of 535 elected officials and 6 non-voting members, dozens of committees, support and administrative offices, flex spaces that host staff meetings, professional development seminars and receptions, a sprawling visitor center, several restaurants, delis, and convenience stores, office supply stores, dry cleaners, cell phone providers, a child care center, barber shops and hair salons, post offices, congressional credit unions, and 2 members-only gyms. There is even an underground subway system that connects the office buildings to the Capitol and an independent power plant that provides chilled and steamed water to cool and heat offices. Walking from one end of the Capitol to the other, which requires traversing different elevations, is tiresome, and I quickly learned if you are working or visiting the Hill, you better wear comfortable shoes. The cognitive dissonance I experienced was jarring, but looking back, it was quite understandable. We look at Congress from a front-page perspective, as it has been grandly depicted on postcards, the $50 bill, and the news. We observe lawmakers in highly dramatized moments like voting, hearings, and speeches against the backdrop of stately ceremonial rooms. However, we do not see all the preparation that goes on backstage across a vast setting and from an array of workers who produce the moments we watch in cable news or social media. This prominent but simplified view not only obscures the size of Congress, but hides all the people who work on the Hill. After my first week on the Hill, I was not sure if I would ever learn how to navigate this place. The Capitol complex includes 6 office buildings, 3 each for the House and Senate. To the south sit the Rayburn, Longworth, and Cannon House office buildings. The Senate side is north of the Capitol building. It includes the Russell, Dirksen, and Hart office buildings. Lawmakers have their personal offices in multi-room suites, which vary in size. The personal offices of freshman representatives can be cramped. Reception areas sometimes double as conference rooms, and aides work side by side in cramped rooms of policy and communication staff. By contrast, senior representatives have more spacious and private office accommodations that can be twice as large. Senators have the largest offices of all, some of which span multiple floors. From the outside, all the neoclassical buildings look distinguished and orderly. However, inside is a different story. It is chaotic. In the summer months, the hallways swell with new intern cohorts and tourists who collide with the usual mix of lawmakers, workers, and K Street lobbyists. It is hard to orient yourself in this sea of dark-hued suits, and it is made more difficult by the unique layout of each building. Navigating the long hallways feels like a maze, and the cacophony of clacking heels, fast-paced conversations, and the deafening buzzers that alert lawmakers to their voting schedule only add to this confusion. Learning the physical layout of the Capitol takes time. However, what truly defines Congress is not its buildings or the rooms inside, but the people who work there. The congressional workforce is divided between 2 groups: staffers who work directly for lawmakers in their personal, committee, and leadership offices, and an army of auxiliary workers who handle the administrative and physical operations of the Capitol. This last group includes police officers, groundskeepers, custodians, food workers, and nonpartisan professionals. Many of these workers are employed by the architect of the Capitol, the federal agency responsible for the maintenance, operation, and preservation of the Capitol complex. In addition, the Clerk of the House and Secretary of the Senate employ a range of nonpartisan professionals like stenographers, curators, HR professionals, and historians.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?